Dear Cypriots of the Diaspora, greetings from Nicosia, Cyprus, from the University of Nicosia. This year, the special conditions created by COVID-19 pandemic prevented many of you from coming to Cyprus. The Presidential Commissioner's Office, the University of Nicosia, and the University of Cyprus joined efforts in order to provide our compatriots abroad with a program of activities to bring Cyprus closer to you. I welcome you to this series of lectures on the modern history of Cyprus. This survey of Cyprus history, under the title From British Rule to the European Union, will attempt to provide you with an overview of events from 1878 to the present. It is, of course, not easy to cover everything in the space of 3 two-hour lectures, but I will attempt to give you a taste of the most essential features of our history, hoping to create an interest for you to delve deeper into more aspects of the history of our island. I would be happy to answer any of your questions and provide further information. You could contact me via email, which appears at the beginning of this presentation. The lecture will attempt to cover the topics that you see now: location, the climate, history, the government, people, religions, sites, the European Union, the current political situation, and, with a big question mark, the future. A very important element in a study of the history of Cyprus is its geostrategic position in the Eastern Mediterranean. This position has actually determined over the centuries its history. It was always this particular geostrategic position that attracted whichever was the dominant power in the area to take Cyprus under its control. This explains the so many conquests of the island over its long history. Characteristics also, which we are going to look at, refer to the resilience of the Cypriot people who survived the various conquests as well as foreign rule and domination. Also of importance is the part played by the Greek Orthodox Church of Cyprus in helping the Greek Cypriot people to maintain their identity. The rich and varied civilization that has developed over the centuries and which encompasses all the influences of the foreign occupiers and their particular civilizations. To give you an idea of what this involves, I have prepared a table, a chronological table, which I will go just very, very quickly over to demonstrate my first point, that is, how many foreign rulers dominated Cyprus. Cyprus has a history that goes back to about 7,400 BC, when the first Neolithic settlement was discovered by archaeologists in what is known as Hierokytia. This is the first sign of organized habitation in Cyprus so far discovered by archaeologists. Then we see the arrival at some point of the Egyptians, very important stage in the development of Cyprus and its people, the arrival and settlement by the Mycenaeans and Achaeans, who actually started the presence of the Greek element on the island of Cyprus. Not much is known about the early Cypriots prior to the arrival of the Mycenaeans and the Achaeans. Because very soon these early settlers assimilated the local element. So what we have is a predominance of the Greek element, the Greek language and the Greek religion with the mythological gods and so on. Then at one point the Phoenicians made their appearance. Phoenicians inhabited the area of what is present day known as Lebanon. They were seafarers and merchants, and they got control of part of Cyprus and settled there. Then there is the arrival of the Assyrians and the Egyptians again. At one point, Cyprus became part of the Persian Empire, and with the conquest of the empire by Alexander the Great, Cyprus became a part of Alexander the Great's empire. Then followed a period of rule under the successors of Alexander the Great, this period known as the Ptolemaic period. We have a series of Arab raids that started around 330 when Cyprus became part of the Byzantine Empire. Then in 1191 Cyprus was taken over by Richard the Lionheart, who was on his way to the holy places in the Third Crusade, leading the Third Crusade. Very soon Richard sold the island to the Knights of the Temple, who in their turn, realizing that it might be difficult for them to control the island, sold it to a Frankish nobleman, Guy de Lusignan, and there followed sort of 300 and so years of Frankish rule, with a succession of Frankish rulers, to be followed by Venetian rule. The Venetians took over from the Franks. In 1571, we have the conquest of the island by the Ottomans, who ruled the island until 1878, when, following an agreement with Britain, the administration of the island was handed over, and Cyprus was under British rule until 1960, when it gained its independence. This is just an idea of this long succession of conquests by different rulers, different peoples, and this influenced the development of the Cypriots over the years. Each one of these left their mark on the culture, on the language in some cases, and they left behind monuments and so on that testify as to their presence and their influence on the local population. Now, the main part was of this lecture is the beginning of British rule. So we start with events which took place in 1877. In 1877, a Russo-Turkish war broke out. This was another in a series of Russo-Turkish wars, part of what has come to be known as the Eastern Question, that is, the attempt by Russia to dismantle the declining Ottoman Empire and gain access to the Mediterranean, and the continued efforts and policy of the British to support the Ottoman Empire, to use it as a defense barrier, a bulwark against Russian penetration towards the Mediterranean. So this war broke out. The Ottoman Empire was in decline. It didn't take long for the Russian forces to enter Ottoman territory and defeat the Ottoman army. And as a result, they imposed on the Ottomans the Treaty of San Stefano. I will not go into all the details of that, but the Ottomans lost territory, considerable territory, and these would have weakened the Ottoman Empire and caused a reaction from the British, who had actually intervened to stop the advance of the Russian army. The British saw their chance. For some time, they wanted to establish a stronger presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. The opening of the Suez Canal had added to the importance of the Eastern Mediterranean, and Cyprus, because of its location, as stated earlier, became therefore a very attractive proposition for the British. Taking advantage of this weak position of the Ottomans and the desire to uphold the Ottoman Empire, they reached an agreement with the Ottomans in June 1878, known as the Cyprus Convention. With this agreement, Britain took over the administration of the island. It is important here to state, because of subsequent developments we shall see, that sovereignty of the island remained Ottoman. The British took over the administration, and they were going to make available a sum of money which became known as the tribute to the Ottomans for the loss of their revenues from the island. This tribute was subsequently to cause friction between the Greek Cypriots, or the Greeks of the island, as they were known at the time, and the British. Later in the same year, June, July, the arrangement, the convention, the Cyprus Convention, was given a kind of international status when it was presented at the Congress of Berlin. The Russians were faced with a fait accompli, and therefore the island became officially a British administrative territory for the time being. Just to complete a little bit, we will come back to this later, to say that in 1914, when the Ottoman Empire entered the First World War on the side of Germany, Britain annexed Cyprus. This resulted in a change in status for the island. 1915 saw what has always been a controversial issue, one of the ifs of history. What if this had happened? Because in 1915, as the First World War progressed, the British government offered Cyprus to Greece in return for Greece entering the war on the side of Britain and its allies. The Greek government, headed by the king, who was of German origin, but using the excuse that Greece wanted to stay neutral, did not pick up the offer. So we really will never know what would have happened, whether Cyprus would have been united with Greece at that time, and of course the course of modern Cypriot history would have been different. That is why I said it's one of the important ifs of history. In 1923, after the end of the First World War and the agreement in Versailles, there was the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, where Turkey, having been defeated or being in a weaker position at the time, the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, signed the Treaty of Lausanne and acknowledged the annexation of Cyprus by Britain. In 1925, Britain declared Cyprus a crown colony. So this developed into something now different. Cyprus, like other colonies in the British Empire, became itself a colony, and the way it was going to be governed was to change. We could say at this point, and I will cover this to a greater extent in the second lecture, that at the beginning the Greek Cypriots welcomed these changes in the status of the island and the fact that Ottoman rule was over, and now they were under what they considered to be a more civilized people, and they had expectations. It is characteristic of how the first British High Commissioner was greeted by the Archbishop, by other Greek Cypriot notables, all indicating their desire for Enosis, union with Greece, and expressing the wish and desire that the British government will or would hand over Cyprus to Greece. This was to change in later years, and we will see that the Greek Cypriots were to come into conflict with the British administration, the British government. The Turks of Cyprus were at first very apprehensive because of the change, but then they attached themselves to the colonial government, feeling that this was the safest way forward for them. Now, these early years were formative years because the British, they turned Cyprus into a colony, but at the same time they wanted to introduce certain changes to reflect their way of governing the island. First, they reformed the administration. Under Ottoman rule, administration of the island was in a very it was very loose, I would say, and did not provide for any effective administration of the island. The Ottomans were mostly interested in two things: that the local population, the majority of whom were the Greeks, would be obedient, not cause trouble, and second, that they would pay taxes. The British introduced reforms in their aim to make the administration more effective, to stop corruption, because at various levels the way the system worked made it easier for both Ottoman officials, but also in some cases locals who cooperated, to make money and promote their own interests. The British administration also created elected municipal councils. Now, we see an attempt by the British to sort of create what at the time would be considered a more, quote, modern system of administration. They abolished the system of tax farming. Tax farming involved the process of giving the right or selling the right of the collection of taxes to some individual through an auction of some kind. And then these people collected the taxes. But this, of course, meant that they would want to make their profit, and it resulted in the people paying higher taxes. In the villages, elections were held for a hetman, kind of what we call in Greek kinotarchis, and it was an attempt to create a system in the villages where there would be accountability and the means through which the British administration would be able to control, one might say, and run the countryside. It introduced measures regarding reforms in the taxation system. So this was, the Cypriots had to pay taxes, but there was an attempt to rationalize the system. Measures were taken to improve agriculture through improvements. The Cypriot peasants suffered a lot when there was a bad year and so on, and they were forced to borrow money. They fell into the hands of moneylenders. They lost their property and so on. And there was an attempt through the reform of the taxation system and the improvement of agriculture to help to a certain extent the peasant population. There were attempts to improve the road system. It was a fact that under Ottoman rule, very little was done by way of improving the infrastructure of anything on the island. And it's something that the British found also inconvenient in their attempt to administer the island effectively. So they began a construction of roads which, were not the modern roads that we see nowadays, but certainly they were an improvement on what existed before. They also embarked on a scheme to take water to the villages. If one were to visit some of these villages, you would see at some point, either in a central position or at the edge of the village, one would see these reservoirs, fountains, and when you look at the dates, you would see that these were very close to each other in different villages, part of this overall attempt to ease the life of the villagers, who before sometimes had to walk distances and carry water from wells for their needs in their homes. There was no water taken to the homes, but at least these reservoirs were close on the outskirts of the village and facilitated and improved the life of the peasants, especially the women who were responsible for these sort of tasks. The colonial government abolished the church's tax exemption on land. Here I want to make a sort of diversion and say something about the role of the church, because again it is very important in understanding and the development of events and the course of Cypriot history. The Greeks on the island, Greek Orthodox, under the Orthodox Church, the Church saw better days during Byzantine rule, for obvious reasons, the same religion and so on, as it came out of the persecution of the early Christians by the Romans. Subsequently, with the arrival of the Franks, the Orthodox Church of Cyprus was to suffer considerably. The Franks were Catholic. Their aim was to establish the Catholic religion on the island and began what was in effect the persecution of the Orthodox Church. When a bishop died, they would not allow the election of another bishop. The few that remained were actually exiled or forced to move away from their bishoprics to more isolated parts of the island, so they would not be in direct contact with local population. The church was really the link between the people and the Greek tradition on the island. That is, the Greek language, the Greek religion, and maintaining this vision of one day joining the island with Greece. Now, the Franks, as we said, persecuted the church, and the church lost a lot of its power in that sense, but not its influence over the local population, who were religious and followed the leadership of the church and their local priest. The same situation continued under the Venetians. With the arrival of the Ottomans in 1571, the situation began to change. The Ottomans saw in the Orthodox Church a useful ally, and therefore began a policy of allowing the church to recover. They allowed the bishops to return to the bishoprics, and in actual fact, they began to work closely with the church in matters of taxation, and it was in this way that the church managed to gain certain privileges, one of which was exemption from taxation on land. And the church was a big landowner over the centuries. It began to accumulate property. When the British arrived, first of all this was alien to them, that the church would be involved so much in the lives of the people, and to a large extent also affecting the administration of the island and the way the British wanted to administer the island. The other thing that has to be stressed at this point, and which would acquire tremendous significance in the years that followed, was the role of the church, the archbishop as the ethnarch, and the desire and involvement of the church in political issues. The church saw itself through its hierarchy, the archbishop and the bishops, as the keeper of the national identity, and which meant, as I said, religion and the language, and without any deviation, the desire, the vision of union of Cyprus with Greece. This was not liked by the British. They could not see how or why the church would get involved in such matters, and certainly they were irritated in that the church could have such influence over the people of the island. Later we will see, when the struggle against colonial rule began, the important role played by the church in leading, encouraging and leading the nationalist movement that would culminate in the Ioga anti-colonial struggle, 1955-1959, with the aim of enosis, that is, uniting Cyprus with Greece. It is also demonstrated very clearly by the fact that the first president of the Republic of Cyprus after 1960 was the late Archbishop Makarios III, who actually remained president. He won successive elections until his death in 1977, was president for a total of 17 years. Now, going back to the administrative and other measures taken by the British government, we see also a serious attempt to improve the legal system. The Ottomans applied the law in a very different way from what the British understood to be law and justice. And therefore, they embarked on a scheme to create a system of justice and to create laws that would reflect the realities in Cyprus at the time. Other than these measures that I have mentioned, which must be admitted that began to have effect and improve the lives of the people in general, and because this very often, because of what happened later, the Ioga struggle, the uprising of the Greek Cypriots against British rule and so on, it overshadows this the work done in the early years as opposed to the situation that prevailed during Ottoman rule. There was no doubt that the Cypriot people gradually benefited from these measures, without, of course, forgetting the fact that the British were foreigners in the eyes of the Cypriots, who just succeeded other foreigners who ruled them before. This would gradually lead to the growth of stronger feelings, a nationalist movement that would eventually erupt in actually armed struggle against the British. Now, something now about political reforms attempted by the British administration in these early years. The colonial administration decided to establish what has been described as Legislative Council. This Legislative Council consisted of 12 elected and 6 ex officio members. Of the 12, 9 were Greeks, 3 were Turks. The ex officio members were mostly British administrators. All male Cypriots over 21 years who had paid their taxes could vote. The council was elected for 5 years. Now, a lot has been said about this Legislative Council and its role. From the British administration point of view, they considered this a progressive measure in the sense that they compared to what the situation was before, where nothing existed. Here they were establishing, in their view, the principle of elections and the representation of the people, both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. However, they did not in any way intend to give power to the people. This was especially in the eyes of the Greek Cypriots gradually, that this was simply what they actually describe the toy council, that it gave the appearance of something more democratic, but in effect, since they could not vote on the budget, they could not decide on taxation and so on expenditure, that this council did not really have any substance, and the governor, since Cyprus became a colony, and this would result in conflicts between especially the Greek Cypriots and the British administration. This is very clearly seen in the events of 1929-30 that led to the October uprising in 1931. We have had a look at the developments that took place as a result of the various measures taken by the colonial administration. And I would like now to say a few things about life, society, and culture in Cyprus during this earlier period of British rule. It is a fact that the majority of the Cypriots, Greeks and Turks, were poor peasants. So these had experienced great hardships under different conquerors, going back, as we said, to the Franks, the Venetians, the Ottomans, and they were, in their vast majority, illiterate and occupied with small-scale farming. They were not rich. Very often they lost their land when in a bad year they were forced to borrow some money, then they couldn't pay, and their land was taken, and they became land workers, working for the richer landowners. Education was very limited in these early years of British rule, because it was something not encouraged by the Ottoman administration, and wherever there was any type of educational institution and so on, it was the result of initiative by the church or some rich individual who decided to donate some money and start some a school. There was a small middle class of merchants, doctors, lawyers, and professionals like teachers and others, who were mostly in the big in relative terms, the cities of Cyprus. They were in Nicosia, in Famagusta, Limassol, Kyrenia, very small, and Paphos. In general, we could say that this was a conservative society that was much influenced by religion and the church. I described earlier the influence which the church had over the people, the majority of which were peasants and very, very religious. Therefore, their way of life reflected this religiousness and conservatism in terms of their social life and so on. There were the first signs of change in this situation because of the measures taken by the British administration. In particular, we notice the growth of the middle class, the professionals. More people were able to send their children, mostly their sons, at the beginning for higher education to Greece, mostly, and a few to the United Kingdom. This was something new in terms of numbers. They were increasing, and these developments were going to bring about social change, as these younger Cypriots, after a few years, began to return to Cyprus as doctors, as lawyers, as teachers, and influenced by their life in Greece, whereby these nationalist ideas, the attachment to Greece and so on, tended to become stronger. So they returned to Cyprus with strong feelings, patriotic feelings in their view of attempting to achieve union of the island with Greece. It was from these sort of people that the nationalist movement was to grow, both within this growing middle class and the church. Parallel cultural activity began to increase and improve, reflecting the fact that there were now more educated people. We see some of the newspapers appearing under difficult conditions. Some of them appeared sort of every 2 weeks, couple of pages, 3 pages. Some of them closed down soon afterwards for financial reasons mainly. These were not easy times, but the signs of something new, something different were beginning to be evident. We see poetry flourishing, fiction, art, all these mostly influenced by Greek culture. It developed within this group of educated people that were returning from Greek universities. This began to create a new climate in Cyprus, still difficult conditions, but not compared to the situation that prevailed under Ottoman rule. In spite of all this and the signs of change, the political issue would predominate. The political issue of the resulting from the demand of the Greek Cypriots for union with Greece, enosis. This would be the major source of conflict with the British colonial administration, the British government, and would mark the later years of British rule, and which would result in armed struggle, and in 1955, which involved suffering by people, involved a killing of people, executions, and so on, to culminate in independence, the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus, which has been described as the reluctant republic. We will be saying more about this in the next lecture, where the main theme will be the growth of this nationalist movement and the events in the 20th century up to 1960, which led to the creation of the independent Republic of Cyprus. What follows is a select bibliography covering different aspects of what I have described, some in a more specialized way, for those who might be interested in any particular aspect of Cyprus history, they could refer perhaps to a particular book that appears on this bibliography. This is by no means an exhaustive bibliography. There is a lot that has been written over the years. I would be happy to provide further information to anyone if I receive an email, to anyone who might be interested in something which he or she cannot trace, and I could provide more information. So this is the bibliography. As I said, it is not an extensive and exhaustive bibliography, and I would like now to move into another part, somewhat different from the first part, where I would like to show you through pictures some of the things that have been mentioned in the course of the lecture, depicting monuments, sites that reflect this long and rich history of our island, and which all together represent what we are today, where we stand today, and what we have as our heritage. This first picture is taken from Hierokitia, the Neolithic settlement that I mentioned. It's reconstructed by archaeologists, and this was the first known settlement in Cyprus, and a very important site indicating the development of organized life on the island. Here is a picture from Kition, which at one time was settled by the Phoenicians, and there, amongst other Greek and Roman findings and so on, we have archaeologists have found remnants of the sort of indicating the presence of the Phoenicians in the area. These are Roman mosaics. They are from in Paphos, where the Roman villa, if you ever visit Cyprus, this is next to the small harbor and the castle there. When the Romans arrived in Cyprus, they moved, the governor moved sort of capital in quotation marks to Paphos, and this was discovered by archaeologists on the floor of this Roman villa, and these are now part of UNESCO World Heritage, unique in their own way. These are some more of these mosaic. They are part now of our legacy of the presence of the Romans on the island. This is Apollo's sanctuary, again indicating the presence of the Greeks and to a certain extent the Romans as well. This is the Agora in Amathunda, again another important site important from an archaeological point of view, important also from a historical point of view. These are more pictures from Amathunda. This is Kurion in close to Limassol. Salamina in the occupied part of Cyprus is one of the most well-known monuments, and this reflects the presence of the Greek element on the island from the early days when Salamina became a very important kingdom under Evagoras the first. This is amphitheater, open amphitheater, Soli, in the occupied part of Cyprus. It's Greek style, but constructed by the Romans. It has been renovated. Now, coming to the Byzantine period, you see that this is St. Hilarion Castle. It was constructed during the time of the Arab raids, aiming to high up on Pentadactylos mountain range to enable the guards there to survey, to look at the sea and look for signs of the Arab raiders approaching Cyprus. This is the monastery of St. Neophytos in Paphos. The Byzantine period is characterized by sort of religion, the establishment of various monasteries, and the paintings on in the churches and in the monasteries that reflect this rich treasure of Byzantine art. This is from the church in the monastery of St. Neophytos. These again are unique in their own way, and very much part of now of our national treasure. Another of the sort of Byzantine small churches of St. Sozomenos. You can see here again the paintings on the wall in the characteristic Byzantine style. This is Kikos Monastery, probably the largest of the monasteries up on Troodos mountain. A number of these monasteries were established, built in isolated places, mostly on the Troodos mountain range and elsewhere. During the period of the Arab raids, this was for reasons of security, safety, hidden in areas which were not further inland, which were not easily reached by the raiders, who in any case did not venture much inland. This was done to protect valuable religious heritage, which and items which one could find in these monasteries. This is Macheras monastery, the other big monastery on the Troodos mountain range. This is Stavrovouni monastery. Again, you can see its location and so on. It was not only for seclusion of the monks and so on, but also for reasons of security. From high up there, they could really watch what was happening around, and it was also very difficult for any enemy to approach and attack easily. This is the church of Asinu. This church has some of the finest mosaics and paintings, and it is now again under UNESCO World Heritage. St. John Church, St. Barnabas Church, an occupied part of Cyprus, St. Nicholas Church. These are various churches with different architecture in some respects, all dating back to Byzantine times. This leads us to the medieval period, the period of the Franks, the Venetians, and there we see a different influence on the island and what they have left behind. This is Belabais Abbey. It is on the Pentadactylos mountain range. One can see here the different style. It was a Catholic monastery, and one can easily identify the different architectural style that reflects more the European Catholic traditions in terms of the construction of churches and monasteries like this one. This again, St. George Church, was constructed by the Franks, and even from what is left, one can see the style that reflects the European, not the Byzantine approach. This is Colossi Castle. When the Venetians took over the island from the Franks, it was not long afterwards that they began to feel the danger from the rising power of the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire was expanding, growing, and as I said earlier in my introduction, inevitably, whichever power controlled the lands in the Eastern Mediterranean would want to have under its control Cyprus. The Venetians were aware of this, that sooner or later the Ottomans will attempt to take Cyprus. So they began to fortify Cyprus, getting ready to defend it. Colossi Castle was one of these castles that was constructed. This is part of the walls of Nicosia, which were constructed by the Venetians. This is Famagusta Gate, and it was one of the gates which led in and out of the city facing east. There was also Kyrenia Gate facing north and Paphos Gate facing west. This is now used as a cultural center by the municipality of Nicosia. It hosts various art exhibitions, cultural events, and so on. And it's there again to remind us of the presence and the passing from Cyprus of the Venetians. These are the Venetian walls that surrounded the old city of Nicosia, again constructed by the Venetians, expecting the Ottoman attack. Another part of the walls. This is in Famagusta Castle. One can see that the Venetians left their mark. That's the lion, the Venetian emblem. And this was constructed to defend the port in Famagusta. It is interesting, perhaps, to note that Shakespeare used this sort of castle for his play Othello, and one part is Othello's tower. This is Paphos Castle, again protecting the small port in Paphos. Kyrenia Castle, and this is what preoccupied the Venetians, which was the defense of the island against the impending danger from the Ottomans. What you see there is an indication of how the Ottoman Empire began to grow, and one can see how all the lands, the shores on the Mediterranean, were taken over by the Ottomans, and Cyprus there, surrounded by this, soon came under attack. The Venetians were unable on their own to defend the island. They expected help from Europe. Divisions and disagreements delayed any expedition, and by the time the Europeans were ready, Cyprus had fallen to the Ottomans in 1571. The Ottomans also left signs of their presence on the island. This is Dragoman Hagiorgakis Kornesios, the most famous. The Dragoman was a kind of interpreter. He was Greek Cypriot and an official of the Sultan, someone who acquired quite a lot of power and influence, to the extent that even Ottoman officials were afraid of him, but he had a tragic end. He was executed at the end. This is the residence of Dragoman Hagiorgakis Kornesios, which can be visited to give you an idea of what the residence of a rich man in Ottoman times was like. This is Archbishop Kyprianos, who was executed by the Ottomans in 1821 because of fear that he was organizing and leading the Greeks on the island to revolt against Ottoman rule. It was also the Archbishop that founded the secondary school, which was called the Hellenic School, which subsequently became the Pan-Cyprian Gymnasium with a long tradition in education. This is Hala Sultan Tekke, it's now near the international airport in Larnaca, and this is a very important monument for religious monument for the Muslims, and again reflecting and showing the presence at the time of the Ottomans on the island. This is St. Nicholas's Cathedral, which was turned into a mosque. The Turkish baths, again reminding us of something which was left by the Ottomans. And here is the beginning of the British colonial period. Here the raising of the British flag on the arrival of the first British officials. Here you see what I described earlier, sort of simple, poor peasants. These are women from the countryside. One can see the way they were dressed. They had to work very hard under very difficult conditions to support the family. This is a typical village woman. She was seen here going to carry water. Women worked very, very hard because also conditions in the homes were difficult. And here is a photo when the British began to take water to the villages. One can see the reservoir there, women gathering, and it became a social place. When they went to take water, they would spend some time chatting and so on. Certainly, this development, the fact that there was now water on the outskirts of the village, sometimes in the very center of the village, made their life much easier. And here, something we are going to talk about more in the next session is a photo of the governor's palace, which was burned down by demonstrators in October 1931, where a demonstration which started basically because of economic, financial reasons, taxation, to which the people objected, developed into an uprising demanding enosis, and it was rather easily crushed by the British authorities, and those involved were punished. Here we go into the period of just the beginning of the EOKA struggle, the armed anti-colonial struggle. These were students demonstrating. One can see the Greek flags and because the whole effort and the demonstrations were enosis, union with Greece. Here you can see these are the graves of young people, Eoga fighters who were executed by the British during the armed struggle. I will be saying more about this in the next lecture, where we will be covering the period in greater detail, the growth of nationalism and all the events that led to what you see here, and the Oka struggle and independence. These are various scenes, photos from the period of the armed struggle. Here we can see at the end of the Eoga struggle is George Grivas, who headed Eoga. He was a military leader at the time of Eoga. And this is Archbishop Makarios. On his return, once agreement had been reached, and prior to the official declaration of independence, here is Archbishop Makarios on the left, first president of the Republic, and on the right, Dr. Fazil Kuchuk, who was the Turkish Cypriot leader and the first vice president of the Republic. This is the government house, which, with some changes which we are going to show at a later stage, became subsequently the presidential palace. This is more what it looks like now, and the Republic. Now here we end the first session. This was an attempt to give you an overall view, first of covering the past centuries with the different conquerors and so on, leading to Ottoman rule, then British takeover, the early years of British rule, the changes brought about by the British colonial government, and I also tried to show something about in pictures, or some of the things that I mentioned earlier in my lecture. Tried to say something about the life and society in Cyprus during these years. Covered partly the background of the feelings of the Cypriots towards the ideal of union, enosis with Greece, which is what I will be covering in greater detail in my next lecture, to show how this movement developed, how it ended up in armed struggle, and the events that led to the birth, the establishment of the Republic of Cyprus. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found this interesting. And in lecture 2, there will be more information on the period 1914-1960. Thank you.